A helicopter landed on the roof of one of France's most secure prisons and stole a prisoner in broad daylight. Paris, May 1986. A police officer looks up and sees a helicopter hovering just above the prison roof. Two inmates are waiting. One of them is holding what appears to be a live grenade. The guards don't fire. A rope drops from the helicopter. One prisoner grabs it and disappears into the Paris skyline. But here's the unbelievable part. That grenade was actually a painted piece of fruit, and the pilot had secretly learned to fly a helicopter under a fake identity for one reason, that's to rescue her husband. This really happened, yet outside France, almost nobody knows the story. To understand how insane this escape was, you have to understand who it was built for. Michel Vaujour wasn't a first-time offender having a rough year. By the time he was in his mid-30s, he'd been cycling in and out of French prisons since he was a teenager. Armed robbery, a violent confrontation with police that nearly cost an officer his life, a string of convictions that stacked up over more than a decade. And here's the part that matters most for this story. He had already escaped custody multiple times before. One of his earlier stunts involved slipping out of a courtroom using a fake handgun he'd built himself out of soap and shoe polish, good enough to fool guards at a glance. It sounds like something out of a heist movie, except it was real and it worked. By 1986, French authorities considered him one of the country's most determined escape risks. He was sitting on a sentence that would keep him behind bars for the next 2 decades. Most people in that position start counting years. Michel started counting exits, but this time he wasn't planning alone. He had something most inmates never get, someone on the outside willing to break the law right alongside him. Her name was Nadine. She and Michel had married while he was already behind bars, and their relationship had basically grown up inside the visiting room. At one point, their daughter was actually born while Nadine herself was serving time. Yes, both of them had done stretches in prison. This wasn't some outsider falling for a bad boy from a distance. Nadine understood exactly what she was signing up for because she'd lived a version of it herself. So when Michel was hit with a sentence that basically meant the rest of his adult life, Nadine didn't just wait around hoping for parole hearings. She started building a plan, and it wasn't a plan involving smuggled tools or bribed guards. It involved a pilot's license. Here's where the story stops sounding like a normal prison break and starts sounding like fiction. Nadine enrolled in helicopter flying lessons, not under her real name. She used an alias so nobody could connect the dots back to her husband's case. For months she showed up, trained, logged hours, and became a familiar face at a small helicopter rental operation outside Paris. As far as anyone there knew, she was just another enthusiast working toward her license. Meanwhile, on the inside, Michel wasn't sitting idle either. He teamed up with a fellow inmate, and the two of them spent months quietly studying the prison's rooftop, the yard, the sight lines, working out exactly where a pickup might be possible. Then they hit a problem. The roof wasn't big enough. There was no clean space for a helicopter to actually land and take back off. If the plan depended on Nadine touching down and picking Michel up like a taxi, it was dead before it started. So they didn't scrap the plan, they upgraded it. Forget landing, they were gonna do this hovering in midair. May 26, 1986, mid-morning. Nadine takes off in a rented helicopter and flies it low, directly over central Paris, straight toward the prison. Air traffic control is reportedly hammering her with warnings over the radio. She ignores every one of them. Inside the walls, Michel and his fellow inmate make their move. They force their way toward a rooftop access point, and this is the part that still sounds unbelievable. Michel is holding those painted nectarines like they're grenades, bluffing an entire security detail with fruit. It works. Guards see what looks like live explosives and hold their fire. The two men break out onto the open roof completely unchallenged. Above them, the helicopter comes into position and holds steady, hovering directly over the building. A line drops down. Michel grabs on and is hauled aboard. His partner in the escape loses his nerve at the last second and stays behind, choosing to surrender rather than make the jump. The helicopter peels away from the prison and disappears into the Paris skyline in the middle of the day, watched by God knows how many people on the ground below. But this wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't even close, because what came next turned into one of the biggest manhunts in modern French history, and it did not end the way you'd expect. The helicopter didn't fly off into some cinematic sunset. Nadine set it down in an athletic field on the edge of the city where a car was already waiting. Within minutes, Michel and Nadine had swapped a stolen helicopter for an ordinary getaway car and vanished into traffic. For a while, they were simply gone. Investigators openly admitted they had no idea where to even start looking. The couple had clearly been planning this for a long time, and that head start made all the difference. It didn't last forever though. Months later, Nadine was tracked down and arrested in the southwest of France. Michel for a while stayed free, but freedom for a man like Michel Vaujour never lasted long because he never actually stopped. Not long after the helicopter escape, he was involved in another robbery attempt that went wrong, and this time there was no clever trick to talk his way out of it. In the confrontation that followed, Michel was shot in the head by police and fell into a coma. Everyone, including his own doctors, expected that to be the end of his story. It wasn't, and what happened after he woke up is the part almost nobody talks about, because it turns this from a crime story into something much stranger. Michel Vaujour survived the gunshot. That alone surprised the people treating him, but the injury changed him permanently, leaving him with lasting brain damage and putting an end, once and for all, to his career as an escape artist. Here's the part that turns this into one of those you can't make this up details. Somewhere in his long recovery, he discovered a talent for painting that he had never shown any sign of before in his life. A man who had spent decades breaking out of buildings started spending his time putting brush to canvas instead, and the work was good enough that it eventually got attention on its own merits. He remained in custody for years afterward, but the man walking out of prison in 2003 on parole was not the same man who'd escaped by helicopter in 1986. By his own account, decades later, he described his real escape as something bigger than any rooftop or aircraft. His actual greatest escape, he said, was from the version of himself that kept ending up behind bars in the first place. His story eventually became the subject of a French documentary. But here's the thing, in most of the English-speaking world, that documentary never crossed over, which means one of the most cinematic, well-documented, verifiably true prison escapes of the last 50 years just never made it into the popular history most of us grew up with. We know Alcatraz, we know The Great Escape from World War II, both incredible stories, both worth remembering. But somehow, a helicopter escape involving fake grenades made of fruit, a wife who secretly learned to fly under a false name, and a man who survived a bullet to the head only to become a painter. That one slipped through the cracks. So here's the real question this story leaves you with. Nadine Vaujour risked everything, learned an entirely new skill in secret, and pulled off one of the most audacious rescues in modern history, all for someone she knew would probably end up back behind bars eventually. Was that loyalty? Was it love? Or was it something closer to obsession? You can make your own call on that one in the comments. If you want more true stories, this unbelievable, the ones that somehow never made it into the history books everyone else already knows, this channel is where you're gonna find them. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.